Welcome to Session 10 of the series An Introduction to the Divine Principle. This session, Principles of Restoration, Part 1, is the first of 5 sessions that will focus on answering the question, how has God been working to restore the ideal? In sessions 2 through 9, we covered 2 important topics, the ideal of creation and the human fall. If we compare God to a doctor, when a doctor wants to heal someone, the first thing the doctor needs to know is how the person's body functions when it is healthy. That's the ideal. Next, the doctor would need to figure out what caused the person to become ill. That's the fall. Once these 2 things are understood, the doctor would be able to tell the patient what they need to do in order to become well. And that's restoration. Likewise, now that we know the ideal and the fall, we are going to be able to understand more clearly than ever before the way that humanity can be healed. We call this the path of restoration. Let's briefly review the ideal. Simply put, the ideal is a beautiful, healthy family in which God's love and truth are fully manifested. That family can be compared to a seed. Let's say you start off with an apple seed. Naturally, the entire tree is going to bear apples. If the first family had been connected to God, the children, the society, the nation, and the world that would have come from that family would have been connected to God. Sadly, that is not the way it is. The love of the first man and woman was not connected to God. Through the fall, love was corrupted by the archangel, and from that fallen love, a family was formed, and through the descendants of that family, throughout humanity's long and painful history, our fallen nature has manifested itself. If we continue with our analogy of the seed and the tree, the family that Adam and Eve formed was a damaged seed. And when that seed grew into a tree, every cell of that tree could not help but be damaged. That damaged tree is today's humanity. How then is this tree going to be healed? Because the identity of a tree is determined by the seed from which it came, whatever you do to its branches, whether you trim them or even cut them off, although you may be able to improve things to a certain extent, you will never be able to change the fundamental nature of the tree. There is only one possible solution. To get a healthy tree, you need to plant a new healthy seed. And what does that mean? It means that God must send to this earth a new Adam, someone who can fulfill what the first Adam failed to accomplish, and that is to become God's true Son. This is the significance of the coming of the Messiah. The Messiah, the Son of God, comes as the new Adam. But a seed can only grow if it contains both the male and female element. Humanity cannot be fixed by a man alone. There must also be a woman who can fulfill what Eve failed to accomplish and become a true daughter of God. When the Messiah, God's Son, and his bride, God's daughter, unite in love and form a true family centered on God, that family will become the new seed that has the power to fix the mistake of Adam and Eve. From such a family, rooted in the truth and love of God, a new history and a new culture will begin to emerge. As this family grows, as its influence expands, the fallen world will at first oppose it. But if it can survive, as its love and truth grows, people will begin to realize that they have a choice. They can either stay where they are, continuing the pattern of the fallen past, or they can choose to separate themselves from that past, the unhealthy tree they have been attached to, and be adopted into God's family. As this process continues, as God's ideal grows, over time it will reach a point when the benefits of God's love and truth will become evident to all people, and all people will want to return to God and become members of God's family. This is how God is going to restore the ideal that was lost in the fall. At this point, you may have a few questions. First, if this is God's plan, why didn't God send the Messiah right after the fall? Second, when God did send the Messiah, Jesus, why didn't Jesus find a bride and get married? Why was he killed? And third, why does God send a man first to find his bride? Why not send a woman as the Messiah? Let's start with the third question. Why is the Messiah a man? As we study the principles of restoration, we will discover that restoration follows a path that reverses what happened in the fall. The fall began when the archangel tempted Eve, who then tempted Adam. To reverse that, God reaches out to a man first, the Messiah, who then reaches out to a woman in the position of Eve. And what about the first question? Why didn't God send the Messiah immediately after the fall? As a matter of fact, we will demonstrate in the next 2 sessions that God was planning to send the Messiah to Adam's family. But when the older brother Cain murdered his younger brother Abel, the foundation that God was preparing for the Messiah was lost, and God had to wait. Let's go back to our analogy of the seed. For a seed to grow and prosper, it needs soil that can support it. If the soil is too poisonous, it will kill the seed. Before God will send the Messiah, he has to first make sure there is a good environment, one that can receive the Messiah. God, knowing the nature of evil, knew that it would seek to kill his son. That is why, before sending his son to this world, God has been willing to invest thousands of years in order to raise up a people of faith who would receive his son, love him, and protect him. How has God done this? In order to prepare the world to receive the Messiah, God has been working through religious people, the prophets and saints and sages of history, in order to appeal to people's original nature and to urge them to act in ways that will move them closer to God's side. That is what the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, is all about. It is a story of how God worked with the descendants of Abraham, the Jewish people, to prepare a people who would be able to receive his son, Jesus. But God's effort did not always go well. Through the fall, humanity became ignorant of God, and our fallen nature has become stronger than our original nature. That is why people tend to act in ways that move them further away from God and thus block God's efforts to send the Messiah. And this brings us to the second question. When God was finally able to send the Messiah, Jesus, why didn't Jesus find a bride and create God's family? Why did God allow Jesus to be killed? In sessions 14, 15, and 16, we will look more closely at Jesus and his mission, and why the people God had prepared to receive him turned against him and rejected him. One thing we know is that in John 9:14, Jesus referred to himself as the bridegroom. If he was the bridegroom, then someone else was prepared by God to be his bride, but Jesus' bride never appeared. This is because the religious foundation that God had prepared for Jesus failed to support and protect him. When Jesus first began his ministry, he proclaimed that God's kingdom was about to come. His early teachings, such as the Sermon on the Mount, were about establishing God's ideal in this world. Jesus taught and did great works in order that the people would be able to recognize that he, Jesus, was the Messiah for whom they had been waiting. But, influenced by their fallen nature, the religious leaders rejected Jesus and began to plot his death. That is why later in his ministry, as is recorded in Matthew 16:21, Jesus changed his message and began to teach about his coming death. By going to his death, although Jesus was not able to establish God's ideal family on the earth, through his sacrifice and resurrection, he was able to create a spiritual family, That spiritual family is the Christian faith. The fact that Jesus was not able to establish a God-centered family, and through that family, establish the seed that would bring God's ideal on the earth, explains why Jesus taught that the Messiah must come again. In fact, the primary purpose of the Christian faith has been to prepare a foundation in the world that will be able to receive the Messiah when he comes again. The fact that it took thousands of years before God could send Jesus, and that it has been thousands of years that the world has waited for the second coming, brings us to the final point of this session. The work of restoration is not only up to God and the Messiah. God's plan to save humanity, his plan to send the Messiah, the new Adam, and restore the family that was lost, cannot be accomplished by God or the Messiah alone. Critical to the success of God's plan is the principle of shared responsibility. God's will can only be fulfilled when God does his part and we humanity do our part. Then what is our responsibility? What is it that we need to do in order for God to send the Messiah and for God's plan to succeed? It is God's responsibility to send the Messiah, the new Adam. It is our responsibility to help prepare the foundation to receive the Messiah. How we do that will be the topic of the next session.